If you can leave as quickly as you can, as we want to get on with the next item on the agenda. As quietly as possible, please. Thank you. Can you be quiet as quickly as possible, please? We want to get on with the next item. Thank you. We're now moving to F15, reducing tax on tourism. Can I just say, those of you who are leaving, can you leave as quietly as possible, please? You'll find it in your conference daily, page 5, one of the amendments. We've had one amendment. We've also had a request for a separate vote, which we are taking. So that can be found conference daily, page 5. And it gives me great pleasure to introduce Eleanor Parrott to actually propose the motion. And I ask Lord Dick Newby to stand by. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair, and good afternoon, Conference. Can I thank the Conference Committee for accepting this motion today and for scheduling it to coincide with the end of Wales's opening match in the Rugby World Cup. To those of my compatriots loyal enough to be in the hall at the moment, can I just say to you, don't worry, Wales never throw it away in the second half. It'll be fine. It'll be fine. As I was leaving Cardiff yesterday, it was great to see thousands of rugby fans lining up to take their photos by the Millennium Stadium. And it reminded me how important tourism is, not only for Wales, but for the whole of the UK. There isn't a single corner of this island, not a single parliamentary seat, that doesn't benefit from tourism. As Liberal Democrats, I believe we should use the levers we have to stimulate the economy and create opportunities so that people can get on in life, no matter where they live. By reducing VAT for tourism, bringing Britain into line with most of our European neighbours, we could do exactly that. That is why a group of local parties from as far apart as Ceredigion, Argyll and Bute, Westmorland and Lonsdale, North Devon and Arran have brought this motion today. 25 of Europe's 28 countries take advantage of a dispensation in EU VAT rules that allows a lower rate of VAT for tourist attractions, cultural events and accommodation. Being out of step with most of Europe puts British tourism at a competitive disadvantage, deterring visitors to the UK and encouraging British travellers to holiday abroad. But while Britain does attract visitors, Visit Britain data shows that fewer and fewer are stepping beyond London. Perceptions that Britain is an expensive place to visit can mean that high-spending visitors from America and the Far East keep the British leg of their European trip short. Businesses outside of the capital suffer, and the visitors who do come spend less in restaurants, shops and visitor attractions simply because they're here for less time. Tourism creates jobs where no other industry can, on every square foot of this island and all of the islands off it. It has been the fastest growing job sector in the UK, employing 3.1 million people, nearly half of whom are under 30 years old. Cutting VAT on tourism could generate 80,000 new jobs over 3 years and 120,000 over 10 years, according to research by Nevin Associates, and provide starter jobs for young people and those with lower skills who might otherwise be at risk of long-term unemployment. According to labour market forecasts by the UK Commission for Employment and Skills, the number of lower-skilled jobs in Britain will fall dramatically over the next 5 years. And while we might welcome a growth in professional jobs, we can't afford to be snobbish about giving people with lower skill levels a chance to get on in life. If we fail to act, tens of thousands of people will be left behind and trapped on benefits as our economy moves forward without them. We are the party who seek to build a more equal society. We cannot be content to watch the gap between the rich and the poor grow and then do nothing to stop it. For those who think that the value of tourism jobs is inevitably low, let me counter that. The tourism sector has proven its commitment to upskilling its workforce. 61% of businesses provide training, and more than half of those employed benefit, a better record than the economy as a whole. In Scotland, that figure is a truly impressive 71%. And in Wales, where we've seen major growth in high adrenaline activity tourism, highly skilled specialist jobs are being created. Tourism has a record to be proud of in valuing people and giving them a break. And it's a lesson I have learned in person. It was a science museum in Cardiff that gave me my first job and then gave me the professional training and qualifications I needed to build a successful career in marketing. Some may be sceptical about the impact of this policy, but we're not relying solely on projections and forecasts. Time and again, the experience of countries who do this proves its effectiveness. The 25 EU countries who have adopted this policy have not gone back. And actually, when the Troika were pressing Greece in all of these difficulties to boost their tax income, they told Greece to protect their lower rate of VAT for tourism because to do otherwise would be economic suicide. Our nearest neighbour, Ireland, is another example of the boost a cut in VAT for tourism can give. Ireland temporarily reduced the VAT on tourism in May 2011, but scrapped plans to revert back to its normal rate because it had been such a huge success. According to Failter Ireland and Deloitte, the cut in VAT on tourism created 30,000 jobs and cost the Irish Treasury less than forecast. And a further study by the National University of Ireland described it as a highly cost-effective way of boosting competitiveness and employment. In Ireland, the evidence shows that tourism businesses have used that boost in earnings positively to invest in training staff and improving facilities, and visitors have seen cheaper prices passed on to them and perceive Ireland as a better value for money destination than they did before. Just imagine the impact this could have on the Cornish coast, the Scottish Highlands, Mid Wales, Norfolk and the Lake District, all rural areas that need an economic boost and suffer financially, but also crucially, socially, when generations of young people are forced to leave to find work. In places like this, when young people leave, communities die on the vine, schools close, facilities disappear, and local high streets fall into decline. By reducing the tax on tourism, we will attract new visitors and encourage them to stay longer and spend more, stimulating local economies and creating jobs in areas that wouldn't otherwise have them. There are places in Britain, especially rural areas, that the economic recovery simply hasn't reached. We have the ability today to do something positive about that. The upfront cost of this policy is £1.2 billion a year, but more than half of that would be recouped in that first year from savings in the unemployment benefits for the people we found work for. The policy would be cost neutral in 3 years and actually earn the Treasury £3.9 billion net profit over its first decade. Turning to the amendment, I'd ask you to think carefully whether it would dilute the positive message we're trying to give, but I welcome the debate. Conference, we are a party in desperate need of clear, radical ideas that will transform lives. Next May, I, alongside colleagues in Scotland, Wales and London, will have to go out and fight for our political lives. We need positive policies we can explain on the doorsteps. This policy will give 120,000 people who have nothing a foot on the career ladder. It will protect vulnerable rural communities across Britain, and it will pay for itself in just 3 years. This policy represents an investment in a fairer economy, and it's an investment worth making. I urge you to support the motion.
I call Dick Newby to propose Amendment 1, and can Peter Landownie stand by, please?
Conference, this motion sends a strong message of our commitment to supporting tourism and the hotel industry. It's a Cinderella sector, as far as government's concerned, which is vitally important, as we've already heard, in many of our more poor and distant and dispersed communities. And there's clearly, as the motion sets out, good evidence that elsewhere in the EU, reducing VAT on tourism and hotels has brought substantial economic benefit. However, we do have to accept that the upfront cost of this policy is extremely significant, £1.2 billion a year, and there'll be an ongoing cost in later years until the increasing tax take through the greater activity in the sector overcomes the initial loss. Now, in my view, one of the great achievements that we had in government was to demonstrate that Liberal Democrats could be trusted with the country's finances. With the Labour Party now abandoning any economic credibility, unless we Lib Dems are serious about our spending plans, we'll allow the Conservatives free rein to make the case for further cuts to investment and support for business, which will damage the wider economy and wider society. We also need to make sure that the benefit of any changes that we make is concentrated into the small, often independent hotels who need it most. I don't know about you, but I feel pretty uncomfortable at the thought of giving a big tax break to the Savoy, the Ritz and the Dorchester. That's why the amendment seeks to identify a way of targeting the support that we give to the smallest hotels and claw back some of the benefit which the larger chains would otherwise gain. The amendment calls for a per room, per night tax on the largest hotels. This wouldn't cover the full upfront costs of the VAT reduction, but it would tilt the benefit towards the smallest hotels and reduce the initial implementation cost of the VAT relief. The idea of a per room, per night charge has been around for quite a while, and as is made clear in the first part of the amendment, it was proposed as a mechanism for increasing local authority funding in a review for the Labour government in 2007. The charge would mean adding a small amount to the cost of staying in a large hotel. The intention is to limit this to larger hotels, and it could be based on both the number of rooms the hotel has and the size of the hotel chain. It wouldn't entirely remove the benefit of the VAT cut proposed in the motions, just to ensure that the largest benefit goes to the smaller and independent hotels. The policy would build on the success of these changes in other countries and the call for such a tax in London, where Camden Council have already introduced the charge at local level. And indeed, in the longer term, once the economic benefits of the change have been felt by the tourism industry and the increase in activity had taken place, then the charge could be transferred to local authorities to help fund local services and improve community infrastructure needed to support tourism. Conference, the amendment seeks to improve the motion, not undermine it, and would help ensure that we can champion the need to support tourism whilst maintaining our record of economic competence and responsibility. Support the amendment and support the motion as amended.
Thank you. And I call Peter Landani for the separate vote. And I ask Jackie Bell to stand by, please.
Thank you. I'm calling for a separate vote on the words "and attractions" in the final line. The reason is because I fully agree that there is a very good case for having a reduced rate on accommodation. As has been said, 25 out of 28 member states in the EU have such a reduced rate, and there are clear competitive disadvantages for the UK hotel and accommodation sector. But when I say 25 out of 28, that's in some ways a little bit misleading, because if you do look in HMRC guidance, you'll see that there are references to a hotel reduced rate, and that's because the Isle of Man is part of the UK for VAT purposes, and there is a reduced rate there for hotels. And it's very successfully operated since 1994. But what there is not a reduced rate for in the Isle of Man is attractions. Now, attractions aren't really strictly defined within the EU legislation. It's very widely drawn. It can cover, you can have a reduced rate for fairs, culture, theatre, circuses, amusement parks. And different member states have adopted different reduced rates. But what is quite clear is that if you have a policy on attractions, you must define them. Because if you don't define them, it's not at all clear what the scope of the relief will be. And one of the criticisms I have of this motion is the fact that it does not define attractions. And depending on the definition you adopt, it would have a very dramatic effect. For example, if you take a very limited definition, which seems to be what's implied by the figures that are given in the motion, but not, dare I say it, the actual narrative and some of the speeches, if you take a very limited definition and just include historic houses, then you can be talking about a cost of in the millions. But if you take a wide definition and adopt the sort of policy they've got in Ireland, you're talking about, according to the Office of Budgetary Responsibility, about 10 billion a year. Now, I put to you, if you're uncertain whether or not you're voting for 250 million or 10 billion, then there's something wrong with the motion, and that's a reason for rejecting that part of it and just sticking to accommodation where there's a clear case. I would also say that actually the motion is a little bit misleading. In the section where it says that 25 out of 28 member states apply this policy, that is not right when it comes to accommodation, when it comes to attractions rather. Only 7 member states, in fact, apply a reduced rate to amusement parks. And in fact, even of those 7, if you look at the 5% rate we'd be applying in the UK, only 3 would in fact apply a rate of 5% or lower. And the same would be true of hotels. So that's hardly what you could call a reason for, that hardly leads to a massive competitive disadvantage. In fact, if you apply this, you will be saying that the UK has a far lower rate for these things than any other country in the EU. Now, I'm not against fun. I do actually at conference, I quite often sneak out for a sneaky game of crazy golf, but that doesn't necessarily mean it should actually there should be a reduced rate on all attractions. There is a very good case for having a reduced rate for hotels, but I'm afraid the same is not true of attractions. The reasons for it are completely different, and in fact there is no good economic argument for it. So I would urge you to remove the words and just stick to a reduced rate on hotels.
Thank you. I call Jackie Bell to speak for the motion. Will Nicholas Belfit please stand by?
Conference. In May, I was the general election candidate for Skipton and Ripon, having previously stood in Richmond. Hard work kept my deposit, and above all, an opportunity to campaign in some of Britain's most beautiful countryside, the Yorkshire Dales. The Dales is an important tourist destination. Think of James Herriot, Wensleydale cheese, Black Sheep ale, and offers a wide range of tourist attractions, eateries and places to stay. Most of them are small family businesses. As candidate, I was approached by representatives of local tourism businesses regarding a campaign ongoing to decrease VAT on tourism. They'd already approached Julian Smith, the sitting MP, who hadn't responded. So they came to me as an alternative, for at that time, Lib Dems were a strong second. The case for lowering VAT on tourism is strong. It would benefit not just the attractions businesses, but also the wider economy of an area, encouraging more people to visit from the UK, locals as well as from abroad, day trips as well as longer stays. Tourism is a big employer in the Dales. Rural employment opportunities are important to keep communities alive and encourage young people to stay rather than move away to work. During the election, I visited and used the facilities at a number of businesses. I met those who worked there or used the facilities. For example, I was impressed by Housestein Gorge near Pateley Bridge. I say near, it's up a great long winding remote road. Outdoor pursuits, campsite, cafe and community post office run by and employing local people. The businesses I spoke to felt the VAT should be lowered to make them competitive with other countries that have done this, like Italy. Countries like Italy also have another advantage. They're more likely to have sunny weather. Recent poor British summers and the recession have affected many small businesses. Poor takings with increasing overheads, just things like converting your tellies for the digital upgrade, resulted in sub-businesses shutting up shop. Such closures affect the business owner, any employers, but also other local services when tourists aren't around to spend in shops, on transport. Not all small operators are VAT registered, but those at the bottom end of registration are the most vulnerable to fluctuations in turnover. You know, they're not like the big chains like the Hilton or Premier Inn. And, you know, the big chains can run the special offers. The Dales isn't the only area that could benefit from lowering VAT. I live in a seaside town in Scotland. We once won Jeux Sans Frontières, but it's lost out to packages in sunny places like Spain. Local hotels have closed. The high streets suffered.
Can you draw your remarks
Yeah.
to a close?
Lowering VAT would lower entrance fees to attraction, and so we should keep that word in line 48. It would lower the price to customers of accommodation and eating. It would give the message that Britain is open for business and welcomes tourists to enjoy the many opportunities that a valued tourist industry has to offer. So please support the motion. Thank you.
Thank you. And I'd like to now call Nicholas Belfitt from the Isle of Wight to speak against the motion. And can Richard Good stand by, please?
Thank you. I feel quite bad because 2 motions I've spoken on, I've been against them. But here I go. I'm against the motion because when it comes to Lib Dem policy, and we've been talking about radical policy, but this is just changing the percent of tax. There's nothing really radical about that. It's getting a cursor and moving it and going, yep, that looks good. What I'm against this motion is because I don't think VAT should actually be a national level decision. I thought this was a great opportunity to have a discussion about maybe opening this sort of devolution, decentralisation box by allowing local councils or even local representative parliaments, if we ever get there, to deciding their own VAT system. See, I'm from the Isle of Wight, and on the Isle of Wight we have a great tourist. You know, everyone's involved in tourism. We have festivals, brings all those tourists, and we all get involved. But I've seen the cost of tourism as well. You know, I'm learning to drive, and I have to drive around the roads, avoiding potholes, because we have giant coaches that destroy the roads. No one sees this cost, and the councils can't repay the roads every time they get destroyed because they haven't got the money to do it. And reducing this tax rate on a national level is going to leave the councils with even less money to rebuild roads, to rebuild areas, which we need if we're going to keep attracting all these tourists. So what I want to kind of say is, I think we need to go back. I think we need to go back to the drawing boards and have a new discussion about this. One, because that will again show that the Liberal Democrats are taking that future step forward, but also because it allows councils, as I said, to have more of a say on their tax policy. And that means that we can keep the benefits of tourism, which I'm not against. And absolutely, of course, we want to keep the benefits to keep councils having those revenues. But I want to see councils to be able to deal with the costs of tourism as well. So when voting on this policy, please, or on this motion, sorry, please think about that. Are we a party that's just adjusting the sliders, or are we the party that's looking on to the next step to developing our society and making it better for everyone? Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you for keeping to time. I called Richard Good from Richmond in Yorkshire, and Richard is for the motion. And can Philip Dunn please stand by?
Conference. You've already heard about how wonderful Yorkshire is. Well, it is God's own county, so you're going to hear a bit more about Yorkshire. And indeed, you're all going to come to York in spring, aren't you? So spend a bit longer there, because it is, honestly, God's own county. But we do need tourism. Whatever the young man from the Isle of Wight just said, some of us rely on tourism for our living. I'm fortunately now retired, and I'm honoured and joyed to live in the Yorkshire Dales. But the view does not pay the rent. So, ladies and gentlemen, what we need to do today is to look at this motion. Yes, there's a good argument, I think, about possibly looking at attractions. Attractions is a bit difficult, is a bit vague. But certainly, we do need to have that help and assistance. I, for 18 years, together with my wife, ran a bed and breakfast. because it was, to be fair, a supplementary business to what I already had a pension from local government, it didn't matter that we didn't have a high income, and indeed, we weren't big enough to register for VAT. But I did chair our local business association for 10 years, probably the smallest in the country, a Swaledale Business Association. But my colleagues, my friends, and my fellow businesses there, they, with perhaps employing 2 or 3 people, were struggling desperately. And I'm sure we'll all agree that the government has, in fact, done a good thing introducing the new ideas about a sensible wage. But how are these small hotels, these bed and breakfasts, these campsites, these amazing chalet businesses that are coming around every corner, how are they going to manage if they've got to pay rightly and correctly proper wages to their staff if they are they're having to charge their customers this ridiculously high rate of VAT? When I was in the bed and breakfast business, many people would come to London first. Very unwise of them, I thought, but they came to London first. And they were put off, genuinely and seriously, by what they had to pay, the cost of staying in London. They were amazed and surprised to find that actually, in many other parts of the country, they could pay a sensible price. But we just had, some of you have seen the glories of Yorkshire last year when, of course, we hosted the best ever Tour de France depart. It was fantastic. And I was in the middle of it and couldn't get out of the Mendale for 2 days, but it was still worthwhile. It was fantastic. But the important thing is, it told the world how wonderful Britain is, how wonderful Yorkshire is, and particularly how wonderful the Yorkshire Dales. And indeed, we went down to Sheffield to Nixbit as well, didn't we, with the Tour of France. But lots of people came then. But they're saying this year, sorry, it's a little bit expensive. Apart from the other things I do in life, I also am a Scout District Commissioner in the most rural Scout district in England. And I have a lot of young people who after they've left Scouts, I see because they're serving in pubs, they're serving in restaurants. It's the only work for some of them. We desperately need, as Tim was saying earlier, we desperately need the housing for those people. They're not going to be able to afford that housing if we don't pay them a decent wage and if their employers aren't given decent income. Support the whole motion, ladies and gentlemen. It is well worthwhile. Thank you.
Thank you. I now call Philip Dunn from Bournemouth, who's going to speak for Amendment 1, and he's a first-time speaker. And can I ask Annie Jordan to please stand by?
Thank you. First of all, I think I'm the first member from Bournemouth to speak. So on behalf of my local party, I'd like to welcome you all to Bournemouth. And I am proud that the first conference of the Lib Dem Fight Back is happening in my town. Now, when I first saw this motion on the agenda several weeks ago and I read through it, I thought, what a fantastic idea. Absolutely brilliant. And then I had a discussion with my local executive, got torn to shreds, rethought, because like a good Lib Dem, I listen. So, like a good Lib Dem, I listen. And I had a rethink. And what I realised that if you look around Bournemouth, we've got 1 or 2 hotels. And you'll notice we've got a Hilton and a Hampton next door. And our local authority, our Tory one-party state local authority, are praising this development as a sign of our strength, of our economic strength in Bournemouth. And not surprisingly, as they're led by a hotelier, and we have 1 or 2 hoteliers on our council, they are supporting their local hospitality association in calling for this change in the VAT. But I sat and thought that actually a nice shiny Hilton in Bournemouth isn't the same as a campsite in Camelford. They appeal to very different markets, they employ very different people. So when I went back and looked at the motion, I felt that actually it's a very blunt tool. And that's why I wanted to support Amendment 1. In Bournemouth here, we have some incredible levels of deprivation. You may not notice them because you will probably focus on the first few streets back from the beach. If you head in that direction, I could take you about 1.5 miles to an area called Boscombe or an area called Springbourne. If we travel in that direction, about 3 miles, we would end up in West Howe, where the local primary school has 63% kids eligible for pupil premium. Now, the Hilton and our nice shiny hotels don't really help those people because when they're recruiting for managers and people like that, they'll recruit nationally. The people who recruit locally are the small family businesses, and we need to support them. And if we can have a policy as suggested in Amendment 1, we can ensure that we're targeting our help on those small local businesses who recruit locally and who will help people living in those areas around our town. So please support Amendment 1.
Thank you. I now call Annie Jordan to speak against Amendment 1. Annie Jordan is also a first-time speaker. And can I ask Christine Jardine to please stand by?
Sorry to be pedantic, it's Amy. Spelt funny. Thank you, Conference. It is my first time speaking after 5 years, but I want to speak against the amendment because I think it devalues the motion as it stands. The amendment fails to define what a smaller hotel is or what the largest hotels are. The EU directives set out industries to which a reduced rate of VAT can apply, and that makes it very clear, very simple to implement. Defining smaller hotels, largest hotels, would add bureaucracy. Bureaucracy is expensive, it is time-consuming, and it is incredibly frustrating. It is not supportive of business. Secondly, changing the rate from 20% to 5% is simple and it's transparent. The 5% rate, or reduced rate of VAT, already exists within UK tax law, and therefore it's already part of standard accounting procedures, meaning it's very simple and cost-effective to administer. It also encourages growth. Growth means more employment opportunities, particularly for our young people, and more training opportunities for our young people. Growth also means the potential for better rates of pay. France has in fact got contracts in place, which means that much of the saving is actually passed on to the employees, and we're seeing better rates of pay. As Elin mentioned earlier, 3.9 billion over 10 years after costs and 120,000 new jobs. This is an investment, which means it will reap rewards, not only financially, but also by supporting communities and businesses to employ and train more people, especially young people, giving skills and experience to our workforce, which can only benefit the country as a whole. I urge you to vote against the amendment, but for the motion as originally submitted. Thank you.
Thank you. I now call Christine Jardine to speak in favour of the motion. And can I ask Doreen James to please stand by?
Hi, I'm Christine Jardine, and I am the Scottish Parliamentary candidate for Aberdeenshire East in next year's elections. And friends, I want to speak for this motion in its entirety because it is central to our economic well-being, and not just in Scotland. And possibly some of you are wondering why a tax cut for tourism is so important to someone whose region is constantly buoyed and whose hotels are always full because of the oil industry. Why do my communities need, and believe me, they do need, this motion to reduce VAT in tourism? Well, for too long, we have seen our hotels as gilt-edged cash cows filled with high-earning oil executives. But those days are gone. And like every other hotel or venue, regardless of size, scale or location, they are now dependent on an increasingly competitive and important tourism industry. In Scotland, the industry is one of 7 sectors targeted by our government at Holyrood for growth, and for good reason. Just a few of the figures. More than 24,000 jobs in the Highlands and Islands alone are directly dependent on tourism. Spending by visitors in Scotland garners £12 billion for the economy every year, and it contributes 5% of Scotland's GDP. Now compare that to the energy capital of Europe, Aberdeen, which contributes 8%, and you begin to see the scale of its importance. It's not a Cinderella sector for us, it's our economic lifeblood, and nowhere more so than in our rural communities. And that's how this reduction in VAT could help. A year ago this weekend, to try to recover from 2 years of campaigning to keep Scotland in the UK, I went on a blind tour of the country, just followed the scenery and stopped where we fancied. Those tactics took us down a single-track road in Argyll to a hotel that for me epitomises what this motion is about, a comfortable family-run hotel. It offered us terrific cuisine, stunning location and great service. And for its community, it was a vital hub of activity. It offered local jobs and brought in cash to a tiny economy which it kept alive. And perhaps it can help create conditions for another enterprising individual to open a small tourist business, a cafe, or crazy golf. That hotel and thousands like it are exactly the sort of small businesses we as Liberal Democrats want to encourage. Many of them individuals taking their first entrepreneurial steps because they want to build a better life for them and their families. Some of them might grow. They might grow into huge groups like the McDonald Hotels, who are contributors to the economies of the Highlands and Islands, Aberdeenshire, the Borders and across the UK. They still create jobs, more jobs and opportunities and openings for other facilities and attractions. And the availability of those hotel rooms at reasonable prices without a room tax allows them to support events and provide the facilities for things like Offshore Europe in Aberdeen, the Edinburgh International Festival, or the Liberal Democrat Conference in Bournemouth. Friends, many will stay small family businesses, and they are perfect examples of the sort of individual entrepreneurs which Tim wants us to encourage and support. They are the small businesses, the growth that our economy needs. But they're small businesses who need our help. Conference, please support this motion.
Thank you. And I call Doreen James from Ealing Borough to speak against. And can I ask Steve Bradley to please stand by?
Fellow Liberal Democrats, yes, there are tourist attractions in the UK that could increase their visitor numbers, but there are places such as the Tower of London that suffer from too many visitors. Some of you as grandparents will have done that test of endurance, the dinosaur exhibition at the Natural History Museum. First, you do the long queue at the platform in South Ken. Then you do the long queue outside the museum, followed by your entrance into it, when there's even a longer queue before you get to the dinosaurs. It's very tiring and it's very stressful. I speak from experience. Sometimes as a tourist, it feels as if the whole world is trying to be at the same place, at the same time, looking at the same thing. In contrast, we enjoyed the British Museum exhibition. Where? In a cinema, with professional guidance and no jostling crowds. As Lib Dems, we must believe that everyone should be able to enjoy the wonderful things the UK has to offer. And so let's look at using modern technology to make available in homes, schools and cinemas worldwide the experience of the UK. The investments of funds from VAT could be developed into online tourism and create jobs while enabling those on lower incomes to experience the UK. It would benefit as well sites from excessive wear and tear. Do we want our cities to be top for visitor numbers or top for quality of life? Consider the city of Barcelona. You've heard of this. It's banned the building of more hotels. Why? Because the number of visitors is destroying the quality of life in the city. We want people to enjoy coming to the UK, not to find the experience so unpleasant that they wish they'd stayed at home. As a Londoner, I beg you to vote against this motion. Thank you.
Now call Steve Bradley from Bath and North East Somerset to speak for the motion, and will Stuart Redaway please stand by?
Thank you, Chair. At conference, I'm here as a delegate from the beautiful city of Bath, the UK's only World Heritage City, and arguably a place in this country most synonymous with tourism. Each year, over 5.5 million people, both domestic and international, visit our city to delight in our Roman baths, our gorgeous and stunning Georgian architecture, and importantly, our vibrant, independent retail, bar, and restaurant scene. We are undoubtedly a city blessed by tourism in a way that others can only dream of. Tourism is the largest sector in Bath's economy in terms of employment, directly providing 10,500 jobs in the city and contributing £205 million every year to our economy. And it enables our city of barely 90,000 people to have the services and facilities of somewhere 2 or 3 times its size. And whilst it's true that tourism and leisure are often considered as sectors with low-paid work, it is nonetheless an important sector for many people, as we've already heard. Tourism may contribute less to Bath's economy per employee than some other sectors do, but contribute to our economy it still does. But if we're honest, and as we've just heard, tourism also brings with it some of its own challenges. Of the 5.5 million people who visit Bath every year, barely a quarter stay overnight. The rest take advantage of Bath's proximity to London, or the fact the city can pretty much be done in a single day. And that means 4 million people come to Bath every year on fleeting visits, their coaches and cars clogging our streets, descending en masse to our attractions and departing a few short hours later, having contributed precious little to the local economy. Worse still, at peak times, the presence of large numbers of day trippers can often deter local residents from coming into the city centre themselves. So, Conference, I urge you to support this motion for 3 main reasons. Firstly, it will improve the international competitiveness of the UK as a tourist destination, helping to reduce our perception as a high-cost destination and hopefully increasing stays and length of stays. Secondly, it will improve the attractiveness of the UK as a domestic destination. Whilst the days of £1 flights on Ryanair may be over, we still have to compete for the attention of British people who have a wide choice of where to go on their stays. And finally, I see a reduction on VAT on tourism services as giving something back to places like Bath, which individually contribute so much to the UK's combined tourist offering. Lower prices would benefit locals as well as visitors and generate employment and economic opportunities, and it would offer the possibility of keeping more of the money the tourism sector generates within our city, in our city. So, Conference, I see this as an opportunity to improve the appeal of UK tourism whilst also giving something back to places like Bath. Please vote for the motion and please also vote for the amendment. Thank you.
Thank you. I now call Stuart Redaway to speak against the motion. And can I ask Sarah Smith to please stand by?
Good afternoon. This motion is special pleading. Most people would like a 5% tax rather than a 20% tax on their interests. One of the consequences of this is that the standard rate of VAT is a lot higher than it need be. 5% rate requires a legal definition to deal with the borderline cases, and this in turn leads to complexity. None of this is in the original motion as written. I'm quite unclear what the motion includes as originally written. Is it all hotels, B&Bs, and etc., or just some, including business hotels, etc.? Is it restaurants and cafes? If so, all. Is it theatres? If so, all. Is it leisure industry? It's not clear. To summarise, 2 reasons to vote against the motion. One is that, in my view, the 5% VAT rate should be abolished and the standard rate brought down to 15% which would have no impact on the tax take overall. Secondly, the definitions are not given in the motion and would result in considerable complexity. Finally, I urge you to support the separate vote, but vote against the motion as a whole. Thank you.
Thank you. I now call Sarah Smith to speak for Amendment 1, lines 6 to 8, and can I ask Councillor Tibben-Buck to please stand by?
Actually, I'm speaking against the amendment.
Sorry, yes, against the amendment.
Thank you. I've been running small businesses in tourist towns in East Kent for 20 years. And for the last 3 years, I've been campaigning in Dover and Deal, where there's a tale of two towns. Deal is really beginning to regenerate itself through the effort of small businesses, running small accommodation and generally boosting tourism. Dover suffers woefully from a lack of national investment in infrastructure, and that is really affecting the economy of the town, and needs the kind of boost that that's proposed by this VAT reduction. It will do something to even the playing field between VAT-registered businesses and the Airbnb competition that they face, which is a real issue for small businesses in our area. And it is an example of direct investment for growth that levels the playing field for them between other countries. And it's a way that we can help invest in growth without, when the government is failing to provide some national investment. So when I saw the motion, I was absolutely delighted and thrilled. And then when I saw the amendment, I was disappointed, and I urge you against voting for it, local towns. The hotels themselves are small, but the business is big. And they'll be able to convert the investment, the money that's released by this reduction in VAT, much faster into new jobs and investment in the towns. So I don't want to see them excluded. I think that Amy made the case very well indeed for not introducing more complexity in the tax system, keeping the policy simple, it's easy to communicate, it supports small businesses, and that's how it'll come across. But let's not make it complicated. Thank you.
Can I call Councillor Timbitt to speak against the motion as a whole, and will Laura Burt please stand by?
Fellow Liberal Democrats, on a sunny September afternoon, enjoying the warm hospitality of Bournemouth, it's very tempting to reward the tourist industry with a tax cut. Yet there are some serious issues raised in this motion as well as by it. I'm asking Conference to vote against the motion for two main reasons. Firstly, I respect the needs of some of those depressed rural areas described by the proposers of this motion. But this motion may meet the needs of some localities, and it would work against the needs of others. It misses the case for a locally determined tourist tax tuned to local community and local industry needs, which is in operation in many of the EU countries which do have the lower level of VAT, and it's charged as well. In Cambridge, where until recently I led the council, for example, our needs are very different from localities like those of the proposers of this motion, and are more similar to places like the views expressed by the Speaker from London. Our city is at times almost overwhelmed by tourism. We do not need a tax cut to encourage tourism. In fact, we may need extra local revenue to meet the costs of tourism, and this could be generated by a local tourism tax. My second reason for requesting opposition to this motion is that tax incentives on industry sectors is a wider issue that requires a strategic approach, considering all industries which could be candidates for them. I suspect that every locality closely dependent on a particular industry might like to see it boosted through the tax system. Manufacturing technology, for example, may be more important in other places in the country. But if this isn't to become simply a bidding game, it first needs a coherent strategic view. Fellow Liberal Democrats, we are committed to local decision-making and fairness for all. I think that to achieve this, we need to start from scratch. And I would suggest that we set up a working party to address this. Cambridge, where I come from, will be happy to take part in this and help to bring back a fresh motion which meets the needs right across the country and right across the industry. So in the meantime, I think it's essential to reject this motion to enable that fresh start to occur. Thank you.
Thank you. And I call Laurie Burt from Solihull Meriden to sum up on the Amendment 1. Thank you. And I ask Martin Horwood to please stand by.
Colleagues, I think this has really been a very, very good debate. And I think that this motion sends out a strong message in support of tourism in this country. Certainly the people who've spoken in terms of the VAT cut have strongly spelled it out. Some people have raised issues about the motion generally or about the amendment, and I just wanted to make a few points about people who've spoken. It's not possible to regionalise VAT rates. The young gentleman from the Isle of Wight, I'm so sorry, but it's EU law that we have to have a national rate. Amy said that it would be too difficult to define what size of hotel it would be. I would disagree. I think we could pick a number. I think 50 would be a very reasonable figure. Doreen James has talked about the difficulties of getting around in London, where there are too many tourists, and certainly having worked in the House of Commons sometimes, I've quite agree with her. I'd quite like them to go home as well. But I don't think that that's a very positive message. I think what's important is that we make sure that other areas get their fair share of the tourists as well, and that some of them go outside London and enjoy the rest of the regional delights that we've got in our country. Stuart Redaway and Tim Bick made the point about special pleading for one industry. And in fact, Stuart said that he felt that we should have a standard rate of 15%. So I've asked him, Dick Newby, to kindly work out what that would be. And on the back of an envelope, he's told me it would cost an additional 20 to 25 billion pounds a year. And we have to be fiscally responsible in what we choose to do. And we are out of kilter with most of Europe. I think that that is very, very clear from, and has been spelled out very clearly by a lot of the speakers this afternoon. So it boils down to we want to support the tourist industry. But on the other hand, we have developed a reputation which we don't want to tarnish in terms of our fiscal responsibility. We would have to find £1.2 billion for the first year, and then we'd have to keep on subsidising it until the benefits eclipsed it. And we are the party of small business. I think there's no question about that. The big hotels can take care of themselves. Philip Dunn was talking about the Hilton in Bournemouth. If it's the Hilton in Bournemouth or if it's the Hilton in London, they are big chains and they're big enough to look after themselves. But I do think it's very important that we do protect our small businesses. So the amendment helps to mitigate the cost of this change while giving full benefit to the little guys. And they are the Liberal people that the Liberal Democrats really want to support. So I would ask you to support tourism and support being financially responsible as well. So please support the amendment.
Thank you. And I call Martin Horwood, MP for Cheltenham, to sum up on the main motion. Thank you.
Thank you, Liz. One or two shameless local plugs there. I'm going to stick to the issues, with barely a passing mention of Cheltenham's new world-class art gallery, the Wilson, our world-famous jump racing, our festivals of literature, jazz, classical music, beer science, comedy design, poetry, food and drink, the performing arts, and ukuleles. All over Britain, our heritage and history, our countryside and coastline, our sport and arts and entertainment help to generate 9% of our GDP and employ 3 million people. Many of them, as Eluned said, entry-level jobs giving people that vital first work experience demanded by so many employers. And small businesses in Cheltenham and elsewhere are at the forefront of making this vital national export industry work. But they face challenges. Economic downturns, English weather, although I have to say Bournemouth is putting on a rather gloriously sunny show today, and VAT, at a rate now hopelessly out of line with our most immediate European competition. Now, Dick and Laura Lee put a good case for Amendment 1, which cites Camden's £1 per room per night hotel charge. Well, Camden can, Cambridge can, Bath can, but Liberal Democrats committed to localism shouldn't bluntly mandate the hotel charge at national level, not just for places which are already strongly on the tourist map who might risk it, but then force it on struggling businesses in the seaside towns or the Dales that we've heard so much about and who've suffered from declining tourism in recent decades. £1.2 billion per annum does sound like a lot. It's a big upfront cost. But it's an investment, not a reward. And it's got a payback of only 3 years. That makes perfectly good economic sense, and it is perfectly fiscally responsible. Local hotel charges are actually the model across Europe, and that's possible now. Don't centralise it. And the problem with targeting, as the amendment says, smaller hotels and attractions is not only how to define them, but of course, as Sarah Smith said, the fact that smaller businesses also benefit from people staying in or visiting major ones. Cheltenham Racecourse is a major multi-million-pound attraction, but the tens of thousands of people who visit it every year stay in small local hotels and guest houses, buy local food, and shop in local shops. And that also means, of course, that you have to leave the word attraction in the wording of the motion too, please. Stuart and Peter, attractions are defined in EU regulations, otherwise the other 20 member states who designate them for a VAT reduction to some degree or another wouldn't have been able to do so. This motion, unamended, will level a playing field that has become terribly uneven. It will help small businesses, it will grow the economy, it will create jobs, and over time it will deliver a net benefit to the Treasury. And it'll be popular too. It's a win-win-win, and it'll help us win too. Please support the motion unamended.
Thank you. We're now going to move to 3 separate votes, so if you could have your cards ready with the voting side to the front. And we're going to vote first on Amendment 1. All those in favour of Amendment 1, please show. Those against? Amendment 1 is clearly lost. We now move to the separate vote, which is taking out the word attractions in line 48. Taking out the word attractions in line 48. Can I see all those in favour? All those against? That's defeated. And now we move to vote on the main motion. Can I see all those in favour? All those against? That is clearly carried. Congratulations, and I'd like to thank my aide, Jeremy Hargreaves, and my aide in the hall, Jenny Lang, and I hand over to Xiao Shihin.